When a rude and entitled elderly white man throws racist insults at a young black girl on a bus, he has no idea who is silently observing him. There was the usual hustle and bustle on a crowded bus during rush hour. Among the crowded passengers was Mr. Thompson, an elderly white man who sat comfortably in a front seat. He clutched his cane tightly, a symbol of his advanced age and supposed wisdom. Beside him sat a middle-aged man who was focused on reading a book. The bus rocked slightly as it moved, causing passengers to be pushed around. A young black girl named Keisha stood close to Mr. Thompson. She was dressed in her school uniform, holding onto her backpack as she tried to keep her balance. Suddenly, the bus lurched, and Keisha accidentally bumped into Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson's face immediately twisted in anger, his eyes narrowed, and his lips pressed into a thin line. He clenched his fist as he glared at Keisha. Mr. Thompson looked Keisha up and down with a snobbish expression and loudly remarked that she didn't belong in the front section. Keisha tried to apologize for bumping into him, even though it wasn't her fault, but she had kicked the hornet's nest. Mr. Thompson had been looking at her with disgust ever since she stepped on the bus, and now he had a reason to go hard on her. Instead of listening to her apology, Mr. Thompson began to make racist comments, his voice dripping with condescension. He implied that people like Keisha shouldn't be allowed on the bus at all, or, at the very least, should be kept separate from others. He complained that she was up to no good, and that it only took one look at her attire to figure it out. He insinuated that she was probably trying to pickpocket him by bumping into him. Keisha felt embarrassment and discomfort at Mr. Thompson's rude and baseless statements. She tried to ignore him, hoping the situation would die down. Engaging with people like Mr. Thompson never resulted in a good outcome, especially for someone like Keisha. There was always someone to blame, and often it was the black girl. However, Mr. Thompson was relentless. He commented again on Keisha's clothes, implying that they were inappropriate for someone who was around front section passengers. His tone became mocking and filled with racism. The other passengers on the bus were visibly uncomfortable with Mr. Thompson's behavior. Some whispered among themselves, shaking their heads in disapproval. A few shot disapproving glances at Mr. Thompson or concerned looks at Keisha, but no one intervened. Among the silent observers was a young woman named Sarah. She felt sympathy for Keisha, who was clearly distressed by Mr. Thompson's tirade. Despite the discomfort and obvious disapproval of the other passengers, Mr. Thompson continued his verbal assault. He seemed ignorant of the growing unease around him, or perhaps he simply didn't care. His focus remained on belittling Keisha, who stood quietly, trying to maintain her composure. Keisha felt a mix of emotions. She was clearly upset, but tried to stay calm, not wanting to escalate the situation further. She glanced around, noticing the other passengers' reactions. She saw the sympathetic looks and the disapproving glances directed at Mr. Thompson, but despite the clear discomfort of those around them, no one stepped in to stop this rude man's ranting. This made her feel alone and isolated. Sarah, who had been silently watching, felt frustration and sadness. She couldn't understand how someone could be so cruel and racist. She wanted to step in and say something, but hesitated, unsure of how to intervene without making the situation worse. She felt for Keisha, who was enduring the verbal attack with dignity. It was clear that Mr. Thompson's behavior was not only upsetting Keisha, but also making everyone around him deeply uncomfortable. Yet, Mr. Thompson seemed to take pleasure in the discomfort he was causing, using his words as weapons to belittle and demean Keisha. Keisha focused on her phone and pretended to be reading, but despite her attempt to ignore him, Mr. Thompson did not stop. He was in a particularly bad mood that day, largely due to the ongoing nasty custody battle with his estranged family, and he was hell-bent on making someone pay. If it wasn't his family, then Keisha was as good an option as any other. James had always considered himself a devoted husband and father. He worked long hours as a firefighter, saving lives and serving his community. Most of all, he always believed that his estranged wife, Linda, was doing her part to keep their home safe and their family intact. But as the years went by, James noticed small changes in Linda's behavior. She seemed increasingly distant and was always preoccupied with her phone, making excuses to go out. The joy that once filled their home had gradually been replaced by cold silences and bitter arguments. James initially thought it was caused by the stress of parenting their 6-year-old daughter, Emma, in the normal downturns of a long-term relationship. But things took a devastating turn one fateful evening. James had come home early from his shift, excited to surprise Linda and Emma with an impromptu dinner outing. As he walked through the front door, he found the house in disarray. Dirty dishes were piled high in the sink, and laundry was scattered across the living room. Most concerning of all, there was no sign of Linda or Emma. Panic set in as James searched the house, calling out their names. He finally found Emma alone in her bedroom, tears streaming down her face. She had been playing with a box of matches she found in a drawer, and a small fire had started on her rug. James quickly extinguished the flames, but the terror in Emma's eyes was something he would never forget. When he asked her where Mommy was, Emma sobbed that her mother had gone to meet a friend. As he comforted Emma, James noticed Linda's laptop on the dining table was still open. A message notification popped up on the screen. James was divided between respecting her privacy and his growing suspicion. So he hesitated for a moment before clicking on the notification. What he discovered made his blood run cold. The message was from a man named Tom. It contained intimate details about their last meeting and plans for another meetup that very evening. As James scrolled through the conversation history, he realized Linda had been having an affair for over a year, sneaking behind his back while neglecting their home and daughter. Determined to get undeniable proof, James decided to track Linda. 2 days later, he followed her to Tom's house and waited outside. After an hour, he knocked on the door, and moments later, Linda answered, shocked to see him standing there. Behind her was a disheveled Tom, who was hastily trying to dress. The look of guilt and betrayal on Linda's face confirmed everything. She tried to stammer out an explanation, but James had heard enough. The final blow came when he learned from Emma that she had been left alone multiple times while Linda went to meet Tom. Realizing how close they had come to disaster that day with Emma's injury, James knew he had to protect his daughter from further neglect and heartbreak. The next morning, he filed for divorce. The betrayal was too deep, and the neglect was too severe. He couldn't look at Linda without seeing the lies and danger she had brought into their lives. Their marriage was over, but that was just the beginning of a bitter custody battle over who would take care of Emma. Now, on this bus ride, Mr. Thompson's frustration and stress manifested as he continued to belittle Keisha. His fear of losing his family made him lash out randomly at people he felt he could ride on. His insults became louder and more offensive as he blamed societal problems like drugs and crime on black people like Keisha. He even questioned why Keisha, an African, was in their country. Keisha tried to remain calm, focusing on her phone, but his words stung deeply. The other passengers continued to watch in discomfort, their eyes darting between Mr. Thompson and Keisha. The tension in the bus was heavy, and the silence from the others made them feel complicit. Keisha's eyes darted around, searching for a friendly face. Sarah finally decided that enough was enough. She could no longer stand by and watch as Mr. Thompson continued his insults. Gathering her courage, she stood up and moved toward Mr. Thompson. She was determined to put an end to the mistreatment. As she did, other passengers seemed to support her intervention. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. Sarah stood right in front of Mr. Thompson and told him to stop. Her voice was firm, but respectful. She told Mr. Thompson that his behavior was unacceptable and that he should treat everyone with dignity and respect. Mr. Thompson was taken aback by Sarah's boldness. He had forgotten that it was even possible for someone to confront him. Instead of listening, he quickly shushed Sarah, dismissing her words with a wave of his hand. Mr. Thompson turned back to Keisha, continuing his rant, but Sarah did not back down. The confrontation drew the attention of more passengers, and they began to murmur in agreement with Sarah. One man whispered to his neighbor that it was about time someone stood up to Mr. Thompson. The attitude of the people on the bus shifted slightly, as more people seemed ready to support Sarah's stance. Even Keisha felt a little bit of hope and gratitude towards Sarah. Mr. Thompson, however, was relentless. He accused Sarah of being too naive to see that people like Keisha were the reason for society's problems. What Mr. Thompson did not know was that someone was watching him closely. It was Mr. Johnson, and he was observing the situation from a few seats behind him. Mr. Thompson had no idea that Mr. Johnson was on the bus, or he wouldn't dare try what he was doing. His voice was louder now, filled with anger and bitterness. The tension was reaching a boiling point. It was so tense that the conductor arrived to check on the commotion. Mr. Thompson immediately seized the opportunity to complain about Keisha. He accused her of being a mugger and demanded that she be removed from the bus. His voice was loud and commanding, almost as if he owned the bus. The conductor tried to calm everyone down and asked for quiet as he tried to understand what was happening. Mr. Thompson was so engrossed in his behavior that he didn't notice the young man tugging at his sleeve, trying to get his attention. The young man was scared of all the shouting and commotion going on around him. Mr. Thompson shushed the young man repeatedly before finally snapping at him and telling him to be quiet. The young man looked around, confused and upset, but remained silent as Mr. Thompson continued his tirade. Finally, Keisha had enough. She had to speak up, and she did by addressing Mr. Thompson directly. She told him that his assumptions were based on ignorance and prejudice. She explained that she had paid for her ticket just like everyone else, and that she was no thief or mugger. She would not allow him to insult her or blame his life issues on her. Her voice was calm but firm. She wouldn't let his insults get to her. Keisha's statement earned her the respect of the other passengers. They were impressed by the way she expressed herself calmly despite the unfairness of the situation. Sarah also addressed the conductor and explained that she had been watching the entire situation and that Keisha had done nothing wrong. It was Mr. Thompson who had been causing the disturbance with his baseless accusations and hurtful comments. The conductor, now understanding the full context, turned to Mr. Thompson and told him that if he continued to cause trouble, he would be asked to leave at the next stop. However, Mr. Thompson remained obstinate. He refused to apologize and doubled down on his insults. The bus reached the next station, and a few passengers, including Keisha, prepared to get off. As Keisha stood up, Mr. Johnson also rose from his seat. He had been observing the situation with increasing concern. Mr. Johnson then stepped forward and introduced himself to Mr. Thompson. The moment he saw him, Mr. Thompson's face paled. He immediately recognized him as the Chief Child Services official handling his family's case. His casual attire and unassuming presence had kept his identity hidden until now. Mr. Johnson explained that he had been listening to his remarks and found them deeply troubling. He reminded Mr. Thompson that he had sworn he had changed and had fought hard to start getting visitation rights with his family. In fact, today was his time with his family. He mentioned that Child Services had been studying his home and his personality to see if he was suitable for partial custody of his family. Mr. Johnson's voice grew stern as he expressed his anger and disappointment. He pointed out that Mr. Thompson had done a lot of pleading, begging, and goodwill moves just to get a whole day with his family, and here he was, ignoring his family and verbally attacking an innocent girl on a bus. He couldn't believe he was throwing away a second chance to get his family. He informed Mr. Thompson that his behavior was not only offensive, but would also ruin his custody battle. Mr. Thompson tried to protest this shocking statement. He was really scared of losing his family. He pretended he had been provoked and was just protecting himself and his family, but Mr. Johnson cut him off. He had been watching him the whole time. There was no excuse for his actions, and his true character had been revealed in how he treated others, especially those who were different from him. Mr. Johnson gave Mr. Thompson a lecture on respect, equality, and the importance of judging people by their character, not their appearance. He emphasized that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, and that his behavior was a clear indicator that he was not yet ready to be a responsible parent. The passengers listened intently, with some even nodding in agreement. Mr. Johnson believed that respect and decency were fundamental values that everyone should uphold, regardless of their frustrations or life circumstances. The way Mr. Thompson had treated Keisha was completely unacceptable, and such behavior would have serious consequences. Mr. Thompson's confidence began to crumble. He looked around the bus, and for the first time, he took note of the disapproving faces of the other passengers. The reality of his situation hit him hard. His stubborn refusal to apologize and his continuous insults led to this public humiliation. And, even worse, the potential loss of his chance to regain custody of his family. Keisha, who had been silently listening, felt a sense of justice being served. She gave Mr. Johnson a grateful nod before stepping off the bus. Sarah, the young woman who had first stood up to Mr. Thompson, gave Keisha a supportive smile before also leaving the bus. The rest of the passengers remained quiet, but they clearly supported the reprimand Mr. Thompson had received. Before Mr. Johnson got off the bus, he turned back to face Mr. Thompson one last time. He told him that change was still possible, but that it required genuine effort and a sincere commitment to becoming a better person. He advised him to reflect on his actions and to understand the impact of his words on others. He hoped that this experience would serve as a wake-up call for him to truly change his ways. As the bus doors closed, Mr. Thompson sat down, stunned and silent. The young man did not grasp the gravity of the situation, but held his elder's hand tightly. Sarah, who had been secretly recording the incident on her phone, decided to post the video online. She felt that sharing the event could highlight the importance of standing up against racism and prejudice. The video quickly went viral and spread across social media platforms. People were outraged at Mr. Thompson's behavior. The consequences for Mr. Thompson were severe. The video's viral spread brought his actions to the attention of Child Services, who had already been monitoring him as part of the custody case. Mr. Johnson and his colleagues concluded that Mr. Thompson's behavior was inconsistent with the responsible parenting required for custody. Mr. Thompson soon received a formal notice from Child Services. They informed him that his recent behavior had shown a lack of judgment and a failure to provide a positive role model for his family. As a result, they decided to deny his request for partial custody. Based on his past record of neglect, his estranged family would keep custody and decide when and if Mr. Thompson could visit. Mr. Thompson was devastated, realizing that his actions on the bus had directly led to this outcome. His prejudice and anger had not only hurt Keisha, but also cost him the chance to be with his family. Keisha moved on from the incident and focused on her daily life. She hoped that the experience would lead to change and encourage more people to stand up against injustice. She was grateful for the support of good people like Sarah and Mr. Johnson. Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing that her recording had made a difference. While Mr. Johnson was pleased that the family would be with their better parent instead of a rude and racist bully, the lesson for Mr. Thompson was harsh but clear. Respect and dignity are important, and our actions have consequences. But the story didn't end there. As the bus continued its journey, more conflicts arose. Keisha, still shaken by the earlier incident, found herself sitting next to an elderly woman named Mrs. Smith, who had been quietly observing the entire scene. Mrs. Smith struck up a conversation with Keisha, expressing her admiration for how calmly Keisha had handled the situation. Mrs. Smith shared her own experiences with discrimination, recounting stories from her younger days. She explained she had always believed in standing up for what was right, no matter the consequences. Keisha found solace in Mrs. Smith's words, feeling a sense of camaraderie with the older woman. Meanwhile, Mr. Thompson's day continued to spiral downward. After being reprimanded by Mr. Johnson, he received a phone call from his lawyer, informing him that his estranged family had filed for full custody, citing the viral video as evidence of his unfit parenting. Mr. Thompson's anger turned into despair as he realized the gravity of his actions. On the other side of the bus, Sarah received a message from her boss. Her video had gained significant traction online, and several news outlets were interested in covering the story. Sarah was thrilled, knowing that the incident could bring about positive change. She decided to give an interview, hoping to shed light on the importance of standing up against racism. As the bus approached its final stop, the tension that had filled the air began to dissipate. The passengers, who had been silent witnesses to the events, started to engage in conversations about what had happened. Some shared their own stories of prejudice, while others expressed their support for Keisha and Sarah. Keisha, feeling a renewed sense of hope, exchanged contact information with Mrs. Smith. They promised to keep in touch, knowing that their shared experiences had forged a bond between them. Sarah, now a local hero, received praise from the other passengers as she disembarked. Mr. Thompson, on the other hand, was left alone with his thoughts. He realized that his actions had not only hurt Keisha, but also jeopardized his relationship with his family. As he sat in silence, he made a vow to change, hoping that one day he could earn back the trust he had lost. In the days that followed, the video continued to spread, sparking a broader conversation about racism and prejudice. News outlets covered the story extensively, and Sarah's interview became a focal point of the discussion. Keisha's story inspired others to come forward with their own experiences, creating a wave of support for those who had been marginalized. Mr. Thompson, now a public figure for all the wrong reasons, faced backlash from his community. He decided to seek professional help, realizing that his prejudice had deep roots that needed to be addressed. He attended therapy sessions, participated in community service, and made genuine efforts to change his ways. Meanwhile, Keisha and Sarah remained in touch. forming a friendship based on their shared experience. They collaborated on initiatives to raise awareness about racism, giving talks at schools and community centers. Their efforts helped create a more inclusive environment, inspiring others to stand up against injustice. As for Mrs. Smith, she continued to mentor Keisha, offering guidance and support. Their bond grew stronger, and together, they worked on various projects to promote equality and respect. The incident on the bus had brought them together, and they used their experience to make a positive impact on their community. In the end, the story of Mr. Thompson, Keisha, and Sarah became a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up against racism and treating others with respect. The viral video served as a catalyst for change, highlighting the impact of individual actions on the broader society. It was a story of redemption, resilience, and the power of human connection. But the ripple effects of the incident continued to unfold. Keisha's newfound visibility led to an opportunity to share her story on a larger platform. She was invited to speak at a major conference on social justice, where she shared her experience and emphasized the importance of empathy and understanding in overcoming prejudice. Sarah, inspired by the positive response to her video, decided to create a documentary exploring the impact of racism and the power of bystander intervention. She interviewed Keisha, Mrs. Smith, and others who had witnessed or experienced similar incidents. The documentary received critical acclaim and was featured at several film festivals. Mr. Thompson, despite facing significant personal and professional setbacks, continued his journey towards self-improvement. He became an advocate for anti-racism education, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of personal growth. His efforts, while initially met with skepticism, gradually earned him a measure of redemption in the eyes of his community. Keisha, though young, was deeply affected by the events. She began to understand the importance of kindness and respect from an early age. With the guidance of her family and the support of her extended family, she grew up in a loving and nurturing environment. The bus incidents also led to changes within the public transportation system. The bus company implemented mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all staff, and new policies were introduced to address and prevent harassment. These measures were well received by the community, fostering a safer and more inclusive environment for all passengers. The story of the bus incident became a powerful example of how a single event could spark widespread change. It highlighted the importance of standing up against injustice, the impact of individual actions, and the potential for personal growth and redemption. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of empathy and understanding. In the years that followed, Keisha, Sarah, and Mrs. Smith continued to work together, advocating for social justice and promoting awareness about racism. Their efforts inspired others to join the cause, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond their initial encounter on the bus. Mr. Thompson, too, continued his journey of self-discovery and growth. He became a vocal advocate for anti-racism education and worked tirelessly to make amends for his past actions. His story served as a reminder that change was possible, even for those who had made serious mistakes. The incident on the bus, once a moment of conflict and tension, ultimately led to a powerful and lasting impact. It was a story of redemption, resilience, and the power of human connection. A testament to the fact that even the most challenging situations could lead to positive change and growth. As the years went by, the lessons learned from that fateful bus ride continued to resonate. The story of Mr. Thompson, Keisha, Sarah, and Mrs. Smith became a symbol of hope and a reminder of the importance of standing up for what is right.